Okay, I'm going to admit all now.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I noticed we've got attendees starting to arrive. We're over 32 already, and we're expecting over 170. Welcome to this Academy of Healthcare Science Professional Bodies Council webinar on aerosol spread of disease and its prevention. Now, many of us have been obviously very concerned about aerosols and infection prevention during and after the pandemic. But this webinar is a first in a series of webinars on subjects of healthcare science prepared and delivered by the finest healthcare scientists in the UK and has been brought to you by the Academy Professional Body Council. The Council is the only regular collective meeting of healthcare professionals in science, and it's a meeting of the presidents and chairs of our UK healthcare science professional bodies to discuss and share the important issues affecting healthcare science and subsequently healthcare. We routinely have presentations and exchanges from the chief scientific officers of the 4 dissolved healthcare systems, respond to consultations and inform each other of initiatives and drivers around healthcare science. The council membership includes many leading lights and leaders in healthcare science. And in this uncertain, unstable, and complicated time coming out of the pandemic, amidst the global economic and political uncertainty going on, we felt that showcasing the best UK healthcare science can offer in regular seminars will help all who are in or rely on healthcare science. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Academy website for those unable to attend live today. I appreciate many of you will have clinical commitments. But please submit further questions to either the chat box. I don't think we have a question and answer opportunity on this, but anyway, to the chat box. And please sit back and enjoy this highly relevant and much needed update on aerosol spread of disease and its prevention. Without further ado, I would like to introduce your 2 co-chairs for the webinar, Dr. Anna Barnes and Professor Stephen O'Connor, themselves 2 leading medical physicists, stroke medical engineers, who will introduce our 3 excellent speakers. Over to you. Thank you.
Anna, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad that you all made it this afternoon. Just to explain a little bit of housekeeping, there's an awful lot of you on the call today, so what we will be doing is taking questions and answers in the chat. I will be fielding those. If someone has already posted a similar question to the one that you would like to ask, please like it, and I will be able to choose the most popular at the end of the presentations. If there's not too many, I'll ask you to put your mic on and ask the question. If there are several, I might just go ahead and ask questions on your behalf. Can you keep your mics and cameras off while the presentations are going on? You can put your cameras back on at the end when we do the Q&A session. I'm going to hand over to Professor O'Connor now, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Anna and Brendan. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce the first speaker
today. First of our three experts is Dr. Christopher Mays, who is a senior radiographer in nuclear medicine at the Royal Liverpool and Broad Green University Hospital NHS Trust. Chris was the chair of the British Nuclear Medicine Society Radiographers, Technologists and Nurses Group for 2 years, 2020 to 22, and represents the British Nuclear Medicine Society on the Professional Bodies Council. Chris is going to talk on lung scans, radioactive aerosols and SARS-CoV-2, lessons for safe practice. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. So, if I put my PowerPoint up, share window, and hopefully hang on button, slideshow from the beginning. Can you see that, folks? I hope so. So, thank you very much for the introduction and giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the fascinating and surprising things that I've had to learn about aerosols over the last few years. I've had to learn this because I work in nuclear medicine using radioactive aerosols in order to safely scan people's lungs. And in order to use them safely, I've had to understand how these particles actually work and how they can be.
Chris, could I interrupt, please? Your slides aren't showing.
Oh dear. Let me just escape here. Let's try share again. And it's on window, isn't it? Can you see that yet?
Yes, yeah, that's perfect.
Let me just go from the beginning.
Yeah, that's
there
good,
we are.
Chris.
Okay, brilliant. Let's just hope. Yeah, it does advance as well. Brilliant. So
just go into presentation mode, Chris.
Hang on a minute. Let me escape. Where am I going to find that?
From the beginning. That'll do.
That's what I did. Okay. Can you see that? And the second slide.
Now you're on F5.
I'm not with you.
Let's carry on as we are. The slides are visible. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I know what you're talking about now, but yeah, well, let's keep going. Okay. So, as I say, I work with radioactive aerosols in order to do lung scans, and I need to understand how aerosols work to use these safely for both the patients and the staff in our clinical environment. So when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, I realized that techniques to manage my radioactive aerosols were actually transferable to control other hazardous aerosols, such as those containing viruses such as SARS-CoV-2. But first, let me tell you a little bit about our radioactive aerosols. So we're going to use radioactive aerosols to do lung scans, which are known as VQ scans or VP scans. Both of those stands for ventilation and perfusion, and it's the ventilation part that uses an aerosol. And we get the patients to inhale this radioactive aerosol, but we need to be aware that there might be some leakage and contamination of radioactivity into our room and laboratory environment and clinical environment. So I've sort of worked out how to do this very safely, and I'm going to share that with you. And the tips that I'm going to give you, I think, are quite relevant, as well as my other speakers are going to hopefully demonstrate, for how we can manage aerosol viruses as well. So to do a lung scan in nuclear medicine, you need one of these things, which is a gamma camera. And as with everything else, there's a guideline to show you how to do this properly for the acceptance and diagnosis properly from our patients. So this one's the European Association of Nuclear Medicine guideline. So we follow that. In the good old days, we used to do it very quickly, just doing a two-dimensional scan. And if you see the ventilation here is we get the patients to inhale a radioactive aerosol, and that coats the lungs, and we can see where the air gets to in the lungs. And then we inject them with radioactivity in the bottom set, and we can see, although the ventilation was excellent, there are defects occurring. So that's positive for PE. That was in the old days. Nowadays, those guidelines persuade us to do it in 3 dimensions, so we do it in slices through the lung, but we're doing the same thing. So this isn't a PE because there's a match defect between the ventilation and the perfusion scan. So that's not, we don't really know what it is, but it actually isn't a PE. But this one is, and we can see that there's quite good ventilation on the top here, but in the middle set.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're not getting your slides. I don't know if you're moving them along on your screen, but the screen that we have in front of us is your PowerPoint application. So we can still only see your title. There we go. Thank you so much. Okay.
Now I've just moved back.
Yeah.
Can you still see that?
Yeah, we can now.
Properly.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there we are. There's a PE in 2 dimensions. There's a matched one. That's not a PE. Here's a PE in 3 dimensions. Okay, so we can see that nicely. So we do the ventilation scan by getting the patients to inhale a radioactive gas or an aerosol. There are a couple of products around. This is an aerosol that we use. Technetium-99m is the radioactive material, and the generator produces a aerosol of very small proportions. Okay, so technetium-99 technigas is labeled nanoparticles of carbon, because the way that this works is we put a pure graphite crucible into that generator, and we put a welding current basically along the graphite, which heats it up to white heat. Now, before we've done that, we've purged out all the air and we put pure oxygen in it so that the carbon doesn't go on fire. And it vaporizes all the radioactive technetium-99m, and it vaporizes some of the carbon as well. And therefore, we get this aerosol that then condenses very small particles. The size range of the particles is 30 to 60 nanometers. And the manufacturers tell us that 80% of particles are less than 0.1 microns. So they're very small particles. And if you look at them under the transmission microscope, you can see these particles very small, but actually they do often sort of agglomerate. And this is a thing that quite often happens with small particles. If you look at an individual particle, we can see that there is here a sort of hexagonal crystallite of carbon, okay? And that's what a technigas individual particle looks like. Now that's about 35 nanometers across, and our friendly coronavirus here of SARS-CoV-2 is about 100 nanometers across. So this is why I started to realize that perhaps using our radioactive aerosols safely would give us a good indication as to how we might use similar techniques to manage virus aerosols as well. So in order to get the patient to inhale it, we wheel that generator across and we connect them up through a tube here to a technigas generator. We put a nose peg on the patients to stop them breathing out through their nose, and we can see that there is another filter on the top here. So it's supposed to be a closed circuit. So the patients inhale along the tube, it goes into their lungs, and if they breathe out something that hasn't stuck into their lungs, it's supposed to get caught in this filter. Now, it's supposed to be a closed circuit, but I began to realize that it wasn't, because I would do some lung scans in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'd go and do some bone scans, and my bone scans would be contaminated with radioactivity. 2 triangles used to appear when I was doing bone scans, which was degrading my bone scan images. So this could only be due to the fact that some of that technetium-99 technigas, that vapor, that aerosol, was escaping into the atmosphere and then getting sucked into the back of the gamma camera. So I complained about this, but was told that this really wasn't anything to worry about and I don't need to get involved in this, which made me a little bit annoyed. So I decided to show that this effect really does happen in a big way. And so I ran a deliberate contamination of a room with that radioactive aerosol. And we can see here, this is before I contaminated the room. There's individual tiny pictures on the top there that are just background levels of radiation. Now, as soon as I did the contamination, it started to build up in the gamma camera, and we start to see the triangles that were appearing on my bone scans. So I demonstrated where these triangles had come from, and what was happening here, as I say, is that the radioactivity was being sucked by cooling fans behind all the radiation shielding to get picked up by the electronics that the fans were cooling, and that was what we were seeing. So that was the pictures, but the graph really confused me, because this was not what I was expecting. I was expecting something looking like this, which is low levels of radioactive contamination until I contaminated, and then it would get sucked into the gamma camera quite quickly before settling and peaking and then decaying away by radioactive decay. What I got was low levels of radioactivity. Well, that was what I was expecting. But when I contaminated it, the levels of radiation contamination, radioactive contamination, went up for more than an hour pretty well linearly. And they're still going up after 2 hours. So settlement was not happening for an hour, because that's a pretty linear graph here. So the aerosol was not settling down onto the ground. It was remaining suspended in the atmosphere for more than an hour, and I was having to breathe this stuff in. And so was my camera, and that was contaminating my camera. And the other thing that this demonstrates, that the room that I was using to scan my patients basically had no ventilation, because you would have seen this being removed before an hour had passed, and the levels peaking and coming down. So this shows that aerosols stay in the atmosphere for a lot longer than you expect, and that unless you've got good ventilation, they will stay in the room and allow you to breathe them all day long. So I wasn't very happy about this at all, because I was having to breathe in this radioactive contamination. Now, that's a deliberate contamination with pure technigas, which is produced as a dry particle. But remember, this might be a bit different when it actually gets into a patient, because your patients have got lungs where the lower airways are containing near saturated, water saturated air at a nice warm 37.5 degrees Celsius. When they breathe this out, then the cooler room air causes supersaturation because the temperature's dropped, and this will cause condensation. So by probably heterogeneous condensation, we get condensation of water vapors, and growth and evaporation is going to affect the final size of the individual sort of now water droplets containing the dry radioactivity. Of course, environmental temperature and humidity of the room is going to be a factor in the aerosols as they're exhaled. So that is my technigas, and it might be a bit bigger than I expected, but so then is the droplets and aerosols containing COVID-19 virus. And we can see here, this is what's generally sort of expected now, that the virus isn't naked, that it's actually enveloped in a little bubble of fluid. So that's what the problem was. I needed to sort it, and I wanted to get rid of my radioactive air out of the environment. So I was taken to see this device, which is just an extraction system. If you take your car to the garage, they've probably got one of these that they put on the end of your exhaust to stop the aerosols coming out of your diesels and fumes coming out of your petrol cars from poisoning the mechanics. So that goes up the blue tube and it gets dumped into the outside environment. So it maintains a clean environment where you're working. So I wanted one of these, but they're a bit cumbersome, to be honest. They catch dust, and you've got to have a big fan in the room next door, and you've got to have a room that is connected easily to an outside wall to vent this stuff out. So I never got one of those, but what I did get is one of these things, which is a fancy HEPA filter. In fact, it's an ULPA filter. I'll discuss this a little bit later. So it's made by a German company. There are a few of these around. ULT is the company, and we can see that it's on wheels, so you can wheel this around to the side of your patient. The grey part has an electric fan in it, which causes a vacuum, and air is drawn through all this piping. So we've got a filter here. Your patient's going to be around at the top of the filter funnel, that transparent funnel, and the air is going to be drawn in and through the blue part, which contains all the filters. So what's in the filter? Well, it's defined as a HEPA filter. I was a bit dubious as to whether these things would work because my particles were very small. I thought, well, if it's just going to sort of get through the holes of your filter, that's not going to be very much good. But HEPA filters were are defined as being high efficiency and that can filtrate 99.97% of contaminant particles so long as they're over 0.3 microns. Well, my naked Technigas particles were a bit smaller than that. So I was given an ULPA filter, which is a high specification HEPA filter, and this one is guaranteed to remove 99.999% of contaminants over 0.12 microns. So that seemed a bit more like it. So I thought, well, we'll give this one a go. It's a randomly arranged pleated mat of microglass fibers, and it's quite fun to realize that HEPA filters were originally developed for the Manhattan Project in the Second World War when they were developing atom bombs to protect the scientists and engineers from contamination from the radioactive materials that they were using. It's really a nice piece of poetry, really, to be using a HEPA filter now not to develop nuclear weapons, but for nuclear medicine. If you put the HEPA filter underneath the microscope, it is a random sort of matrix of these glass fibers here. And there's a great review that you can freely download from NASA, who use loads of HEPA filters in their space stations, because when you're in the middle of space, you can't just open the window to clear the air. So they use these things to purify the air in the space stations. So this thing's available to download from NASA if you'd like to, and I really recommend it, because it shows you how HEPA filters work. And HEPA filters just are not a simple straining device like a T strainer. You do have the straining action for very large particles, but most of our particles are going to be quite small, our aerosol. So the biggest ones have got quite a bit of momentum behind them. So although the air is sort of weaving its way between all the fibers of the filter, the large particles can't change direction so much because of the momentum, and they can actually impale themselves by inertial impaction within the fibers, and that stops those particles. There's another way that the filters work, and that's interception, where you can get the particles that follow the stream of air going through the filters, but every now and again they're going to have a glancing contact with the fibers, and then short-range forces are going to adhere these things and stop them by sticking them onto the filter material. The smallest particles, you might think, were able to find their way through more easily, but interestingly enough, Brownian motion kicks in, and you can see these things are buffeted by other molecules as they're making their way through the fibers, doing a random walk through these things, and this increases these very tiny particles' chance of coming into contact with the filtration material, and so they adhere themselves there. So that's the way they work, and altogether they work to filter very small aerosols very, very efficiently. So ordinary HEPA filter has this 99.7% efficiency, which is great, but that is the worst efficiency at the 0.3 microns, because the larger particles, they get impacted more and intercepted more. Okay, so the larger particles are stopped more efficiently than 99.7, and the smaller particles, like my Technigas aerosols, they actually are more affected by the Brownian motions, and therefore they are intercepted as well. So the 99.7, what the HEPA filter is defined as being the efficiency of its filtration rate, is actually the worst case scenario, and it's usually going to be better than that for particles of a size greater than 0.3 microns. So I wanted to tell the world about this because one of the things that I thought was that if we can stop Technigas aerosols using a HEPA or ULPA filter, then you should be able to stop virus aerosols as well. So I rushed into print here. In May 2020, I sent my manuscript off, and it was accepted by July. I wanted to do it quickly because I thought the pandemic would be over very, very quickly, and I was totally wrong in that. But I could only hint that HEPA filtration and ULPA filtration would be useful because I had no evidence to suggest that they would actually stop the virus-laden aerosols as well. So I hope my speakers, as they continue in this webinar, will be able to persuade you that that is indeed the case. So to come to an end, I've given you a little talk about the use of radioactive aerosols in nuclear medicine. I've shown you that radioactive aerosols remain airborne for long periods in air, and that's the case for a lot of aerosols actually. And I've also said that by ventilating the room, you can remove these aerosols, and if you can't ventilate it to the outside, then by using a HEPA or an ULPA filtration system that I've shown you, this should be an effective control measure against radioactive aerosols, and by comparison may well be very, very useful to stop our virus-laden aerosols containing SARS-CoV-2. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. A very, very interesting presentation. So without further ado, we'll move on to our second expert, Professor Tony Fisher, NHS consultant clinical scientist at the University of Liverpool and the NHS Innovation Agency of Physics at the University of Liverpool. Tony is a non-executive director of the Academy of Healthcare Science. He received a well-deserved MBE in 2017 for his services to healthcare science and awarded the Chief Scientific Officer's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2022. So without further ado, I will invite Tony to give his presentation on smart engineering solutions can mitigate airborne transmission risks. Where is the evidence? Over to you, Tony.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much indeed. And colleagues, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. Chris, thanks very much for that entree that you've given to me on HEPA filters, and I'll be looking at those later on in my presentation. I'll just load up my talk for you. Okay, we're good to go, Steve?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, so this is really, one more COVID-19 story. I was at the start of the, December 2019, I was working alongside Chris actually in the Royal Liverpool Hospital, because I was seconded to the Chief Scientific Office to undertake some special projects. And one was to look at how we can mitigate the risks of airborne pathogens floating around the place and affecting fallow times between patient treatments in dental surgeries, dental hospital suites and endoscopy suites. And that broadened out generally to aerosol transmission of pathogens. So we put a team together, and this was again pretty much driven by the Chief Scientific Officer. But the clinical scientists I work with include Paul, who'll be speaking to you later, but Claire Greaves, Peter Bill and Chris Hopkins down in Wales, Frank Mills from the IMEC-E, their healthcare group, Nick Rhodes from the University of Liverpool, and Fred and Patman from a commercial group who supplied some of our mathematics to do our computational fluid dynamic modeling. And finally, Gary Hogan and colleagues at the Feed Water Laboratory, accredited for certain microbiology techniques that we're using to biovalidate our techniques. Well, just 3 ways to mitigate airborne pathogens, really. Ventilation, ventilation, ventilation. Of course, that gives me echoes of Tony Blair all those years ago, but maybe also Jean Van Tam. Now, John Van Tam, JVT. Now, if he didn't say it, he really should have done. Ventilation is the key to this mitigation. Important to realise that clean air and fresh air are not the same. Many ventilation systems just bring in fresh air from the outside. It is a mistake to assume that it is that is clean. So 3 ventilation methods. Yeah, open the windows, rely on the healthcare spaces, heating, ventilation and air conditioning system, or employ some sort of local air sanitization or air scrubbing, as we've started to call it. Now, I'll be referring to a number of organizations that provide standards written ahead of the C19 pandemic, but have informed our work over the last 30 months. ASHRAE is the big society in the States, which brings together all the engineering physics expertise in North America relating to all aspects of ventilation control in buildings. CIBSE is its UK counterpart. The CSO commissioned this work, and IPEM instituted much of the cooperative work that we've done with Angela Douglas at the CSO in the Clinical Engineering Network. I'll refer a few times to the HCM 0301, which is the regulatory document, which tells, not regulatory, so the advice document, which tells us how we should be looking after the ventilation of our buildings. Well, so many devices appeared, didn't they, January, February 2021 on how we can clean up the air. Now, this is just one that was on Amazon. Now, as a dad and granddad, I certainly wish I had one of these. It would certainly beat hours and hours of reading Mr. Men's stories. The bottom line is there was an outrageous number of quite atrocious devices out there, freely available on Amazon and internet sites that offered all sorts of bonuses. Really, it was a matter of snake oil, and I actually want to examine these claims made by some of the manufacturers and then move on to how we, within the NHS, looked at ways of verifying the engineering and physics and validating the bioefficacy of devices that are genuinely useful in healthcare spaces. So I'll look at the C19 challenge, we'll look at the hazard, and then we'll look at the principal mitigation route by using ventilation. Look at some smart ventilation devices, and then we'll try to understand the technical dynamics of how transmission occurs in healthcare spaces by using some high-level mathematics within the framework of computational fluid dynamics. We'll verify and validate how these smart devices work. And to that end, we built a laboratory in Liverpool where we verified the engineering and physics. That's easy. And we biovalidated the bioefficacy for the infection prevention and control community. Very hard. Stern critics, very difficult people to convince that what we're doing is safe and effective. And then we supplied some governance assurance to NHS supply chain to make sure that money spent on ventilation, claiming to be smart technology, was indeed good value for money. We wrote some standards, we've come up with some regulations, and finally I'll look at some clinical considerations. Well, we started looking at endoscopy theatres, and we know what they're like. They're very busy, busy spaces, patients, people, equipment, corners, lots of static areas, typical volumes between 70 to 110 cubic meters, very difficult to ventilate efficiently. Dental surgeries, we know far too much about dentists, don't we, as patients. Smaller by and large, average 75 cubic meters, busy equipment, dental assistants, dental practitioners, and patients, really rather difficult to ventilate effectively and with confidence. So let's consider the hazard. The hazard is something which precipitates our consideration of risk, isn't it? So two scenarios. Patient in the room, the treatment produces C19 from the patient. So this would be the dentist, this would be the endoscopist. Clinical staff are exposed to infection risk. So this becomes an issue for the HSE, okay, looking after our staff colleagues. Mitigation, reasonably straightforward. Continuous low intensity air sanitization, some sort of unobtrusive ventilation. An opportunity here to be smart about how we do this. Second scenario, patient leaves the room. We assume now the room airspace is contaminated. Well, this could be a bit like Chris's scenario he described to us earlier on, where patient leaves and yet the atmosphere is contaminated with his technigas. So the way you deal with this is to have a fallow period. And I've already seen people put questions in the chat box about this. So patient leaves the room, the environment's contaminated, the cleaning staff are at risk, the next patient is at risk. Mitigation, fallow time, i.e. let spontaneous clearance occur, logistically very inefficient. The rate at which we could pass patients along pathways massively compromised by spending large amounts of time essentially doing nothing, letting inefficient ventilation systems clear the air, and rely to some degree, without evidence, that aerosol generated particles and smaller particles will eventually precipitate out onto the floor where they're no longer a hazard, no longer a risk. That is not good science. High intensity ventilation, robust, agricultural, noisy, it doesn't really matter for a short amount of time, long that we can with confidence decrease the fallow time. Just a little bit about the main challenge here. The work started off with aerosol generated particles, AGPs, a very, very big problem. So we know our virus, 100 nanometers maximum dimension, and in the respiratory phase, we talk about transmission being in the spectrum of the particle size, 0.1 micron, up to about 5 microns, and that by and large forms the aerosol spectrum of particles. AGPs tend to be larger, micro droplets, up to 25 micrometers, and dental sprays, which are basically small spit particles. The ensemble spectrum of particle sizes is 0.1 to about 0.5 millimeter. Now, Chris told us a bit about HEPA filters. HEPA filters exclude most of particles bigger than 0.25 micrometers by mechanical sieving, but we know, and Chris made a good description of this, other mechanisms operate, essentially absorption and adsorption at the macromolecular level, and I'll look at that later. Principal mitigation is ventilation, measured by the number of times you change the room air. And we coined the term ACH, air changes per hour. The more air changes per hour, the quicker a given clearance is achieved in a healthcare space. At what rate does this proceed? Well, it's a A-level maths first order exponential clearance for a well-mixed room. If you change the air once, you get a 63% clearance, and that's called the time constant of clearance. If you do it twice, you get 95%. If you change the air 4 times in 1 hour, you'll exclude if you exclude it 4 changes per se in any given period, you'll clear 99.5%. Okay. Right. The infection prevention college don't like to talk in clearance, like to talk in log reduction. Log reduction is referred to the number of 9s in the percentage that you clear the room by. So a 1 log reduction is a 90% clearance, 2 log reduction, 99%, and so on. So a 5 log reduction is 5 9s, 99.999. Okay. After 10 air changes per hour, you achieve 0.1% remaining contaminant, or 99.9%. clearance. And these are the graphs, exponential decay graphs, or the inverse of decay graphs, of the clearance rate achieved by different numbers of air changes per hour. So lots of air changes, quick clearance, not many air changes, slow clearance. The more time elapses, the relative rate of decrease of clearance in turn decreases. Okay, so that's exponentially less useful as time proceeds. Okay. How do we increase ACH? Well, upspec the building HVAC, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. Look in the ceiling where you're at the moment, you probably see grills like this, which may be admitting or removing air, and they're powered by big pieces of kit like this sitting on the roof of the building by and large. Very expensive. Something like 12% of the capital cost of building a hospital relates to the ventilation. In fact, with the new standards, probably even more. So what we do? Replace, that's not economically viable. Upgrade the existing. In some places we can do that. We can upspec it, turn up the fans, improve the filters, whatever. Augment the existing system by being a bit smart. We can do it centrally by using conventional technology, or we can go smart, or we can use local solutions and go smart. Okay, augmenting the existing solutions. All right, well, you can't open the windows, and here's a nice example of just putting a bit of additional kit in the ceiling of a healthcare space. It's actually the access room ahead of the A&E department of Maidstone Hospital. A small piece of kit in there raised the inherent air changes per hour from 1, adding 8 to 9. Okay, so kit in the roof using an ultraviolet technology, like explained in a moment, improved the ventilation from 1 to 9 ACH. How expensive was it? What's the economics? Well, the payback is something like 18 months. Why so much? Because you are conserving heat and you're not having to throw well-earned, well-paid-for hot air out of windows. And we'll talk about this later. So that's quite a success story. We started to look at how these devices work, and there's a big piece of kit in the Liverpool lab about to go into evaluation. This one uses ultraviolet light. There's banks of ultraviolet light in it, and it's got lots of safety attached to it because people in ultraviolet light at short wavelengths, by and large, don't get on very well together. That's with a central solution by improving the hospital or the healthcare space, heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. But what about using local solutions? And this is smart air scrubbing. And these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples of local pieces of kit that can be wheeled into a room or bolted to the ceiling that will recirculate air locally, adding to the number of effective air changes per hour. What does it look like? Well, 2 simple diagrams here. Patient, piece of kit on the corner, just recirculates air. Patient, piece of kit in the ceiling, recirculates the air. As the air recirculates, it goes through a box, and this box sanitizes the air. The effective ACH is the ACH offered by the healthcare space, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, plus that which is offered by the air scrubber. There's an example air scrubber there. Air in through the sides, clean air out through the top. This model assumes that there's very good mixing. If there's not good mixing, the simple exponential clearance model I described a moment ago doesn't work. There's a detailed diagram of the first kit that we started to roll out in February 2021 across NHS England, Scotland, and Wales. A box, a fan, and a load of ultraviolet light. These also went into some of the LAMP PCR laboratories as well. And this is an example of that piece of kit being put into a 6-bay ward that's been repurposed for critical level care delivery. 6 beds, 4 of these units. The effective air changes per hour are those from the hospital ventilation system, plus those which are offered by these pieces of air scrubbing kit. Okay, lots of examples. This one has been on the market for a while. It's very popular with the dentists in the high street, but look at this. Clears 45 meters cubed room in 1.3 minutes. I know the company, they're a good company, the engineering is good, but isn't this absolutely useless science? Clearance to what level? 5%, 10%, 99%? Very, very typical of kit that's appeared on the market in the last 2.5 years, very, very quickly, and there hasn't really been good governance of how they're delivered. We notice here the technology is somehow been recommended by SAGE. Well, I was on SAGE and we didn't recommend it. More on air scrubbers. This one's taken apart here. It goes on the wall. Interestingly, this is at One Birdcage Walk, which is the headquarters of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and their healthcare group channel put these all around the place to try and improve the ventilation of their Victoria building. A nice piece of kit just come out about 6 months ago, mounted on the ceiling. It does not directly interface with the HVAC. It's simply a recirculation device. It replaces 2 ceiling tiles. I like this in particular because out the way, people don't trip over it. It can be installed literally in 2 or 3 hours, so there's no interruption to clinical flow if this is done out of hours. Okay, so let's look about what's in the box. A fan, one of Chris's HEPA filters and other filters maybe, ultraviolet reaction chamber maybe, possibly an electroprecipitating filter. We'll talk about that in a moment. And maybe some emerging technologies. In ASHRAE, the American Society, talk about these electroplasma coronal discharge, ozone hypochlorous generators, and so on. The emerging technologies are interesting. They are not recommended by SAGE, and we are looking at those as possible solutions to infection transmission and mitigation of airborne pathogens in the future. So let's look at HEPA, UV, and electroprecipitating filters. Well, we're all world experts now on HEPA because Chris has told us how they work. They don't simply work as filters, i.e. they don't work as a colander would, separating out your peas from your water. Okay, so in red, not as simple as just a mechanical sieve. What we have, as particles get smaller, you start to get reaction with the particles, with the fibers. And we call these, if you like, a combination of absorption processes, and I won't go into them in any detail. Chris gave us this diagram. If you put all those forces together plus mechanical sieving, you get a performance which has a minimum, and the minimum performance defines what it says on the tin, i.e. what its particle size is. Smaller particles will be held up in the filter far smaller than its MPP, its most penetrating particle size specification. So Chris's very, very small particles will be very highly retained by a HEPA filter, even though it's specified as having a cutoff of, shall we say, 0.2 microns. It'll work far less than that. Okay, so viruses, small viruses, if they were singletons, will be held up by this. Well, perhaps more exciting, I think, is the realization that we can use ultraviolet light in the UVC, the 254 approximate nanometer spectral range to inactivate and deactivate spores, bacteria, and viruses. It's not really that novel. The Americans have been using this for many years and used it 35 years ago to handle their problems with TB. But quickly, the way UVC inactivates microbes per se, it interacts with DNA and RNA, with nucleic acids. Where 2 thiamine or uracil bases are close together, under sufficient amounts of ultraviolet light, they spontaneously dimerize. And when dimerized, the RNA or the DNA, as I've got shown it here, is no longer patent. So a bacterium with dimerized DNA cannot reproduce, and RNA in so compromised at aerosol level in a virus cannot allow propagation. So diagram shows DNA. For COVID, of course, we were looking at single-strand RNA. Okay, a little bit of physics, not too much here. Light falling into our infected area will be irradiation. It has field strength, and we mentioned that we measure that in power per unit area. The dose of radiation delivered, the fluence, is this irradiation multiplied by the amount of time, and that gives us the unit of joules per meter squared. So it's not the irradiation per se, it's the radiation per area per unit time. The more time, the bigger the dose. The bigger the dose, the greater the inactivation potential. And in hand-waving terms, across the spectrum of microbes of interest within healthcare, we're attempting to deliver homogeneously between 1 and 10 millijoules per centimeter squared. A very recent piece of technology that's become available, we've looked at HEPA, we've looked at ultraviolet, and now we're looking at electrostatic scrubbers. These have only been available in the UK for the last few months. Very, very interesting. Basically, pass air through a metallic grid at very high voltage, particles become charged, and on transit through the device will precipitate out spontaneously at lower potential collecting electrodes. So in this device here, potentially we've got, potentially, excuse that play on words, between 10 and 50 kilovolts. This is taken from the AirDog, a manufacturer of one of these pieces of kits that we've been looking at in great deal of literature. This is how their machine works. Air comes in through a pre-filter just to pick up fluff, basically. It goes through a matrix of charging electrodes, put minus 12 kV on particles. They then spontaneously precipitated out by collecting electrodes at earth potential. The gas which exits here is free of particles, however, is likely to be contaminated with ozone. So an active carbon filter here absorbs the ozone, and the benefit also of picking up smells and volatiles and whatever that tend to be in healthcare spaces anyway. And this is the piece of kit. Shocking name, but it's quite interesting, and we're looking at this device in Liverpool at the moment. So HEPA, ultraviolet light, electrostatic air scrubbers. Okay, so how can we use this type of technology to decrease the fallow time, the resting time in between patients, in between Chris's patients, in between endoscopy patients, in between dental patients, and so on? And we put together a little web tool here that, and I won't go through the detail, but basically, if you say, I want a certain fallow time and I want a certain clearance, exactly, and this is the size of my room, exactly what air scrubber do I need and how long do I have to use it for? And this has been well used, this tool. There's been something like 3,500 hits in the last 30 months, and people have used it in many design studies. Exactly what kit do I put in, shall we say, my endoscopy suite to achieve a clearance of 99.9% in 12 minutes? Well, this piece of kit here, this is a web page, allows you to calculate it. So just, oops. Okay. All right, so this is a design study we did here for somebody. Fallow period was decreased from 30 to 10 minutes by using an air scrubber. The clearance happened to go from 92% to 98%, okay? And that piece of kit, which I'll show in a moment, took 5 minutes to install, and we've shown by using air plate sampling that's highly effective. Okay, and I've shown that already. Okay, so this is the kit in situ. How do we know that ventilation produced here actually circulates freely around the space and does some good? So we've gone to computational fluid dynamics to actually look at how air spaces are diluted by ventilation, how pathogens in various forms, i.e. aerosols, microdroplets, sub-aerosol particle sizes, are distributed. Okay. We started off with Peter Bill down in Birmingham, looking at what happens in some of their dental theatres, and simple start, model the room, and just look at what happens to existing HVAC performance by changing the grill in the ceiling. Okay, so on the left we have the initial grill, and the blue splodge coming in represents an ingress of a bolus of air, its distribution, and its removal. On the right, we took a computational virtual chisel to that grill on the left there, took the middle out, just to see whether that had much of an effect. Well, it absolutely did. Just by changing the grill, we could completely modify the distribution and rate of removal of air, like that. Now, this looks like a cartoon. It's not. It's actually a very, very big piece of mathematics, which is very rigorous and very, very robust. Okay, so going back to the original one here. Okay, what happens if we add into that space a simple air scrubber that delivers, I don't know, 180 cubic meters of air per hour? Very, very modest. Okay, well, these two realizations are running in the same time. Go. So I think you'll agree with me that the addition of that simple air scrubber there has dramatically improved the distribution and removal of a bolus of air. And this is, I thought, a very convincing engineering description of how a modest change to the ventilation strategy can be of great use. We moved on to being really quite subtle by looking at how AGP is produced in a dental procedure, move from the patient's mouth, from the treatment area, and where they go in the space. Well, heavy particles don't go very far. They land on the patient's chest, and this was modeled knowing all about the distribution of particle size and all that kind of stuff. You'll notice some particles drop to the side here. Heavy particles, that's AGPs, and heavier particles again tend to precipitate spontaneously under the influence of gravity and under Stokes' law. But it's possible to get really quite carried away here. In fact, we were carried away by looking at all sorts of models for all types of dental procedures and all types of particle sizes. Okay, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this. Okay, and that's a flow vector diagram of show where particle moves. Okay, right. So there's a little look at the kind of implementation. There is no kite marking. There are no standards for these devices. There's no way of assuring our colleagues that this is clinically useful. There's no way of assuring our colleagues that this kind of technology is safe. What happens if you pour water over an electrostatic device that's got -12 kV on it? What happens if you expose a patient or a colleague to ultraviolet light when it's delivering 10 millijoules per centimeter scale? Well, you'd have thought CE marking would have sorted this out, and by Easter 2021, we saw lots of devices coming onto the market with CE marks on. Well, there are two CE marks. The one on the left, which is the CE mark, which we understand, then the one on the right, which actually stands for China export. Okay, and that was on a lot of devices coming from Asia, and a lot of those devices were snake oil. Okay, and I acknowledge the expression snake oil from my colleague Prof. Kath Noakes, Leeds University and Sage, who uncovered an awful lot of these. We need to be smart. We need to have assurance. We need to know that we can CE mark the devices, or the UKRA, which is the post-Brexit version of this. So what did we do? We needed to verify and we need to validate, and we set all that kit up in Liverpool. Are the physics good? I.e., are the engineering, are the physics principles delivered effectively? Is the engineering good? And this is called verification. This is all very easy. Electrical tests, easy to do. You can measure the ultraviolet light, you can characterize the airflow, and you can work out what the doses are. And we use lots of fancy kit to do that. Okay. Not very impressive. So I spent 3 months setting up this to look at many devices for NHS England, and infection prevention control were not impressed. Not at all. They kept on saying, this is all very good, but does it actually work? So what they wanted was not verification, they wanted validation, biovalidation. So we built a second lab, the Liverpool Biovalidation Laboratory. Okay, where are we? Device biovalidation, does it inactivate bacteria and viruses as per the claim? Well, you've got to test it. So you need a chamber or a large room, you control temperature, humidity. Ideally, you want to test it with SARS-CoV-2, don't you? Because that was the main challenge at the time, or maybe a bacterial surrogate, but really the virus itself would be great. You've got to put it in the air by inoculation, then take it out. The rate at which you take it out tells you something about the bioefficacy. You could sample it directly onto an agar plate, yeah, or you could impinge it into water by using a sparger or something like that. Assay, well, if it's COVID, you can assay it using PCR lamp. We have very good access to that in Liverpool. You could grow a bacterial lawn on agar for a virus and look at it on plates. If a bacterium, you just grow it on bacterium. So we kind of considered all these. But then we were faced with the practical challenges of actually doing it rather than just writing a paper about it. Temperature, humidity, easy. Test organism. There's no way that medical physicists and clinical engineers were going to want to play with SARS-CoV-2 viruses. So we needed a bacterial surrogate that was safe to play with. And we chose Micrococcus luteus. Micrococcus luteus is environmentally reasonably abundant. It's non-pathological. It's easy to grow. It's bright orange, so it's easy to count, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Inoculation, we use a simple respiratory nebulizer, and sampling, we use a rather sophisticated technique called a Coriolis impinger, and I'll show you some diagrams of that in a moment. And bugs, yeah, we simply grew them on agar from the liquid samples. And the metric that we were using was the log reduction rate over 60 minutes, and then quotes how much air is produced in 10 minutes. We wrote the Liverpool biovalidation protocol, and we've generated something like, I don't know, 2,000 or more agar plates to biovalidate various devices. This is the protocol. I'll not go through the details here, but it'll be on the website for people to look at. Basically, I took a load of luteus, threw it in the air, and saw how quickly it was removed. This is what our laboratory looks like, based in the old medical school in Liverpool. The first chamber is 55 meters cubed. That's about the size of a small endoscopy suite or a large dental treatment area. Okay, we understood a fair bit about Micrococcus luteus because it's actually used by the suntan industry. So in the dermatological scientists knew a lot about assaying potential cosmetics for their resistance to ultraviolet light by using Micrococcus luteus experiments. The test conditions 25, 45, and made sure the whole room was ventilated well. This is what the bug looks like when it's grown on a plate. Nice bright orange. We used an Omicron nebulizer, and this is the nebulizer here, mounted in front of a fan. Okay, this is one type of sampler, and this is the sampling system that we use in Liverpool, and these are a couple of devices under test in the background. And this is the Coriolis technique. Air is sucked through this chamber at 200 litres over 4 to 40 seconds, and that is then assayed for Micrococcus luteus. We're using very, very sophisticated air handling technology to drive the system. Thank you very much, Henry. Okay. The microbiology is conducted by colleagues in the accredited laboratory and feed water, and we spiral plate all the samples using this piece of kit here. And this is ink to demonstrate spiral plating, an agar plate on the left. The sample is sucked up, in the middle, spun round. So in the middle, there's a high concentration. At the periphery, there's a low concentration. So we have a high dynamic range of concentration across the plate. And then we read them in a digital visual reader. So the whole thing becomes reasonably non-subjective. Okay, and that's what a plate looks like when it's put in the digital reader. Okay, so if we've done all this work, and we have done an awful lot of work using our surrogate for all things Micrococcus luteus. Okay, for UV, which is our principal interest, how does it stack up in terms of sensitivity to bugs and viruses of clinical interest? And this is a new piece of work which has come out from our colleagues PRS, whom we partnered with to do this work in the States. So the most resistant of all these microbes here is Micrococcus luteus. It's very, very little tough cookie under UVC. And then increasing sensitivity or susceptibility to UVC, we got through polio, norovirus, coli liver, SARS-CoV-2 and bird flu up there. So was Micrococcus a good choice? Absolutely. If you can deactivate Micrococcus luteus, you can deactivate pretty much all these very easy, more easily with much lower doses of ultraviolet light. In passing, I've noticed where we are with Aspergillus niger, there's becoming more interest in Aspergillus generally. We're doing a piece of work with colleagues from Scotland on this. It is 50 times more difficult to inactivate than measles as it happens. So that's a different piece of work for another day. The reports that we generate when we look at a device are very, very comprehensive. We think that our accuracy, precision, and resolution is at least an order of magnitude better than anything that's been achieved in the States by ASHRAE. We've gone to this level of rigor basically because the claims that people are making for the devices, it's so important that we can validate them. Okay, and our validation metric.
Hi, Tony. Yeah. Could we see whether we could wrap up the next minute or two, please?
Yeah, I'm almost done, Steve. Absolutely. Okay, you did say carry on talking till it went dark. Okay, so the validation metric we use is just the time to deliver 1 cubic meter of air to one log reduction. We've written the government, the request of Cabinet Office, we've written a new guideline and standard for using these devices. Okay, and we are working with colleagues from Wales who've done concluded now a systematic rapid review of all the kit that's out there available in UK. And I just joined the National Infection Prevention and Control group that's going to be reviewing all the information that currently have on fallow times. Okay, there we are. Sorry I ran over a little bit, but I felt I had a lot to say this morning.
You did have a lot to say. It was fascinating. Thank you so much, Tony. Very informative. So without further ado, I will move on and invite Professor Paul White to make his presentation, the removal of airborne SARS-CoV-2 and other bioaerosols by air filtration in a healthcare setting, real life experience on COVID-19 surge wards. Paul is a consultant clinical scientist and head of clinical engineering at the Cambridge University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust. He is a visiting professor of clinical engineering at Anglia Ruskin University. He is the East of England clinical engineering lead, and he is the NHS England clinical entrepreneur. Over to you, Paul. Thank you. You're on mute, Paul.
Apologies. Even after all this time, we still can't get it right in terms of, right, I've now got a problem with the slides. Can you see the slides?
I can see the first slide. Can you just move on? Yes, it's moving on too. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So it's not on the right screen. So if I'm not looking at the camera, that's the reason why. Apologies. Stephen, thank you. So this is really looking and taking the stuff that both Chris and Tony have spoken about. In a healthcare setting, it's our sort of real life experience, and I'm just going to describe really what we did. And I really just want to take people back to right at the start of the pandemic, where we were dealing with something that we'd never really dealt with before. And in the first and second wave, with 65,000 to 100,000 patients being infected per day in the UK. And not only that, the number of people in hospital was sort of peaking at 40,000. It was an area we've never ever seen before, and it was a massive challenge. And also what we've seen with the different variants, with Omicron, they spread faster. It's not only with respiratory transmission, it's also around deposition, and it has become a challenge. And clinical engineering have been involved throughout pandemic. I was involved with the local equipping to enable 140 bed ventilatory capacity with a super surge capability of 200 beds just in the one centre. Then looking at sort of the national clinical and technical due diligence of ICU equipment, but predominantly ICU consumables, and taking what Tony described as the China export mark and trying to verify and validate with the MHRA and the Cabinet Office whether these actually were bona fide devices and whether they met the specificational requirements. As well as that, we're also were looking at local and clinical technical due diligence, PPE for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and we created also we also had some time for innovation. So we created sort of these things, which are the air savers to prevent tissue necrosis with masks, and we developed our own transparent mask, which is CE marked and on the market now through supply chain. But also, as very relevant for this meeting, is that we looked at these small devices, as previous speakers have talked about, these things called air scrubbers. So why is it we did that? Well, if you recall, back in the beginning of the pandemic, there were some serious concerns around supply chain issues, and there were PPE shortages. There were PPE that was coming into the country that maybe might not be as less than ideal, and therefore there was serious issues in our ICUs locally around the PPE was the single sole barrier between the staff and the pandemic SARS-CoV-2. And there was issues and concerns locally about how can we try and mitigate and reduce the risk to staff working in ICU. And as colleagues have spoken before, there were a number of these air scrubbers that were coming onto the market with massive claims that there was no validation because effectively they'd come to market so quickly. And really, we looked at what was basically written in terms of academic output, and there was this, which was a study from the Royal Melbourne Hospital, which was looking at the airflow transmission and clearance of aerosols in clinical spaces. But it was using glycerine-based aerosol as the surrogate of the respiratory aerosols. And what this research showed was that the aerosols rapidly traveled from the patient room into other parts of the ward. And they saw with this glycerine-based surrogate that air cleaners were effective in increasing the clearance of aerosols in the clinical spaces and reducing that also within other parts of the ward. And that with two small air cleaners in a single patient room, 99% of the aerosols could be cleared within 5.5 minutes, and therefore concluded in the study that it may be useful to have these in clinical spaces to reduce the risk of respiratory viruses that are transmitted as aerosols. So we took that information and we put together a team here in Cambridge. So we had the ICU, the Department of Anaesthesia, the Department of Infectious Diseases, the Clinical Microbiology Lab, the Institute of Therapeutic Immunology and Infectious Diseases, again within the university, and ourselves, predominantly myself, and really went to see whether we could do what they had done in Melbourne with a surrogate, but actually in a clinical environment. Bearing in mind at the time we were putting these in, it was full PPE to get into the area in order to take the study forward. And it was conducted in 2 repurposed areas. So we had the ICU, and then we had the surge and super surge areas to allow us to have 140 ventilated patients up to 200 ventilated patients. So the study was, as I say, conducted in these repurposed COVID-19 areas. One area we classified as a surge ward because we wanted to look at it. What are the differences between the ward, and are there any differences between that and the surge ICU? In the surge ward, we were managing patients requiring simple oxygen therapy and very little or no respiratory support, compared to those in the surge ICU, where we were managing patients requiring invasive and non-invasive ventilation with high nasal oxygen. And both those units were passively ventilated with 2 to 4 air changes per hour at baseline, which wasn't massive, is not great, and it's not very high. And just to point out that the ICU was occupied by a further bed, a 6th bed, in week 2 of the study, which unfortunately we couldn't predict when we started. So what is it we did? Well, we took 2 of these units, one by Filtrex, the other by MaxVac. The only reason why we took those was that they were quite keen that they were going to give us a whole load for free if we wanted to verify them. And we made very, very clear at the outset that if the output was negative, that we were still going to write the paper, and effectively the fact that they gave us 3 units was not going to change the scientific conclusion. So we put these air filters in place in fixed positions at the start of the initiation of the 3-week study. We switched them on at the beginning of week 2 and run them continuously from Sunday to Sunday for 24 hours a day, providing 5 to 10 room volume filtrations per hour. And we also then performed a crossover evaluation with the primary outcome being the detection of SARS-CoV-2 RNA in the various fractions of the air samples. And the air sampling, like you saw with the system that Tony was using, we used a National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, the NIOSH 2-stage cyclone air sampler, in accordance with some of the previous studies that had been done at Addenbrooke's. And this is what it looks like. Effectively, air comes in at the top, there's cyclonic motion, and there's deposition of large particles, which are around 4 micrometers in size or larger. The air that hasn't been impacted then moves into the smaller tube, and then we see sort of 1 to 4 microns actually deposited in that area. So that's effectively what we did as a sampling device, and this is it in the flesh. So what do we do with those? Well, air samplers were assembled daily within a controlled sample, with a controlled sample left in a sealed bag. That was our control. The samplers were placed adjacent to the air filter inlets, and others approximately 4 meters from the filter and no closer than 2 meters to the patient. In order for electrical safety elements, we were within the 1.5 meters. In the ICU, 2 distant samplers were also used, one mounted at head height and one at bed height, and the samplers were operated on weekdays between 8:15 and 2:15, and there was a reason for that. That was around the availability of staff. A lot of the staff that we had for this study were volunteers as we were, giving up our time for free at weekends and evenings in order to allow this to happen. After sampling, the samplers were disassembled using sterile techniques, and they were processed and then stored at in -80 degrees until analysis was actually obtained. The nucleic acid was extracted from each NIOSH sampler, and extractions of the reverse transcription quantitative real-time PCR, the RT-qPCR, for SARS-CoV-2 was undertaken, and the high throughput qPCR was also taken for bacterial, viral and fungal pathogens that were potentially in the air in those units. So what were the results? Well, we ran them from January the 18th to February the 5th. There was 100% occupancy. 15 patients were admitted to the ward, 14 patients to the ICU. All patients were symptomatic and tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 and also had respiratory complications. In the ward during the first week, whilst the air was filtered, it was inactive. We both were able to detect SARS-CoV-2 on all of the sampling days, and I'll show that in a minute. And the RNA was detected in both the medium 1 to 4 micron and the large greater 4 micron particulate fractions from the NIOSH sampler. The air filter was then run continuously in week 2, and we were unable to detect SARS-CoV-2 RNA in any of the sample fractions on any of the 5 testing days. And then we put in back control in terms of that we completed the study by repeating the sampling with an inactive air filter, as we did in week 1. And again, what we were able to see was detection of SARS-CoV-2 RNA in the medium, and again, in the large particulate fractions on days 3 or 5 days of sampling. And SARS-CoV-2 RNA was not detected from the control sampler. So if you look at this is effectively where the air scrubbers were put in the surge ward. At the time, we hadn't done any of the work with Tony and the rest of our group around optimal position of air scrubbers. It was literally by chance. This is where we put them, and I think actually the results will show that you could probably put them anywhere. And what we can see when the air filter was off, we had bacteria, we had fungal, we had viruses, we had Candida, Staph, E. coli, and all sorts of elements of air pathogens that came from the surge ward. The filter was installed, as I say, in this marked location. It was operated at 1,000 meter cubed per hour with a room volume of approximately 107 meter cubed, and we took these qPCRs to detect a range of viral, bacterial, and fungal targets. If you look at the surge ward, as I say, the filter was off for the first week, and we were able to see aerosol fractions, large, medium, and small. Again, we then turned it off in week 2. We turned it on in week 2, and we weren't able to detect SARS-CoV-2 at all. And in the control week 3, we turned it back on again. And funny enough, we had SARS-CoV-2 and the other respiratory pathogens come back. Equally, we did a similar thing in the ICU. And I think the difference between this is that we actually have more bacterial, fungal and viral spores in the ICU, mainly because we had open ventilation with CPAP and high frequency or high flow treatment to patients. And again, when we turned the air filter on, we didn't actually see as much. There was a little bit of background element. There was one patient that had created this as an outlier, but in order to be open and transparent, we left those in. You could have argued that they were on a completely different system and therefore had contributed to that. But I think to be open and transparent, we saw less in the ITU than we would have had without having air scrubbers in situ. And again, these were operating at 1,000 meter cubed per hour with a room volume of approximately 195 meter cubed. I think we can conclude that we were able to detect airborne SARS-CoV-2 RNA in this repurposed ward and intensive care unit. That found by air filtration, we can remove SARS-CoV-2 RNA below the limit of qPCR detection, and that SARS-CoV-2 was infrequently detected in the air of the surge ICU. However, the device retained its ability to reduce microbial bioaerosols. And therefore, using air scrubbers, I think we've been able to show that we can mitigate the reduction and availability of airborne infection in these areas, and therefore help improve the risk to staff as a result of scrubbing out the SARS-CoV-2 element. And as Tony has said, the NHS Clinical Engineering Network with Tony, Claire Greaves, Chris Hopkins, Pete Bill, working with Frank Mills from CIBC and IMECE, and also with Fred, we've learned a lot since the start of this study, which was right at the start of the pandemic. And as I say, it's the first international study that has used this technology in clinical situ, and has to identify that air scrubbers do remove SARS-CoV-2. I think that there are a couple of studies now that are now being reported in the literature in 2022. But if you go back to the study that we did, it was in 2019. And therefore, we were sort of not really clear at the time some of the things now that the team that's on the slide here we've put together and we've learned. And just using, as Tony showed you, with computational flow dynamics in collaboration with Fred from the ESI group, we were able to look at how airflow distributes around the room, what are the impact points, what is the volume and average age of the air, and also in terms of eddies and flow, and also about how flow might actually hit the ground depending on whether you've got open windows or non-open windows, or the existing units, and how, if you're not putting them in the right place, you can actually get flow over the patient, which with SARS-CoV-2 wouldn't be a great outcome. So what are my final thoughts? My final thoughts, based on our study, as I say, which was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and what we know now, air scrubbers can be used safely in a clinical environment at distances greater than 1.5 meters from the patient in order to ensure electrical safety requirements. There is one device that we're evaluating here at Addenbrooke's, which is a local company which meets EN 60601, so the electrical safety requirements of medical devices, but large majority of them don't do that, hence the reason for having them greater than 1.5 meters from the patient. The position of the air scrubber in relation to existing airflow from, as I say, air conditioning or windows is imperative to prevent this airflow over the patient. But I think what we were able to show with our study, even prior to the knowledge that's since been obtained by modeling using computational flow dynamics, is that we were able to show that air scrubbers were able to clear the clinical environment of SARS-CoV-2. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for another fascinating presentation. I'll now pass over to Dr. Anna Barnes for the questions and hopefully some answers. Thank you.
So if you are interested in putting on your camera, please do, just to say hi. So I think I'm going to call on Amanda Roger to begin with. She's asked quite a few questions in the chat. Amanda, you wanted to ask some questions around spirometry and some questions around whether or not just opening a window between appointments would be a good idea. Amanda, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, hello. Yeah, I'm asking a few questions really around general practice doing spirometry, or whether it's on a mobile unit doing spirometry. There seems to be really a lot of different approaches. So we've got one approach which is simply opening the window, having a mask under the chin, and then if you do cough, if you're doing spirometry, it will contain the spread of the virus, and obviously doing some COVID screening beforehand. So some people are just using that level of measurement and maybe having a good cleaning between patients and then proceeding to the next patient. Others are just having a single room, doing one patient in that room a day, opening the windows, and then others are maybe using filters, but there seems to be a real broad approach. And certainly, you know, when we restarted spirometry, there was guidance on HEPA filters, air changes an hour, but it seems to have simmered down now where, you know, as long as we're cleaning, as long as we've got that mask, a window open for ventilation. And so it's really trying to drill it down to what is good practice, what is acceptable, what fallow time. Certainly from the ARTP perspective, we were discussing fallow time, and it just doesn't seem that there's clear guidance, and it seems to be very broad. So I just wondered if you could help.
Paul or Tony, would you like to?
Tony, shall I start, and then do you want to follow on? Yeah. So thank you very much for your question. The whole thing around taking one patient and doing one patient a day and opening the windows sort of fills me with slight horror, especially bearing in mind post-COVID that we need to catch up with testing patients. I think opening the window does help. I think what we've shown with the use of air scrubbers is that having sufficient air scrubbers in situ, the fact that patients are coughing in that clinical environment, I think I've shown with the ICU study quite clearly, you know, where we've got open respiratory ventilation procedures, that maybe having an air scrubber in situ in the lab would actually be beneficial for two reasons. One, it will protect the staff as well, and I think that is a good thing. But equally also, by having them in appropriate places in the lab or in the mobile environment that you talk about, it would also reduce the fallow time as well. So it will actually then allow you to do more patients than you would have done if just by opening the windows and waiting half an hour for the deposition of particles. Tony, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Opening windows seems nice and easy, doesn't it? But you know, more than 50% of rooms don't have windows that open. They're painted closed. Some hospitals we've been to, you open the windows, the patients get cold, so they close them straight away. Exactly how well ventilated rooms should be is described by that nasty document that I introduced on my first slide, HCM03. 65% of all healthcare spaces do not meet the minimum requirement. Okay, so you're really struggling, you know, in your clinic, Amanda, to start with. It's very unlikely that you've got the minimum number of ACH there, along with the pressures we have from transmissibility of SARS-CoV-2. Looking at Paul's work and maybe our own work and of others in our group, it's very difficult to provide an argument not for using these simple air scrubbers, insofar as they're very cheap. We show that they work, the engineering is now good, and we can model exactly the fallow time that you need between patients to achieve the clearance that you require. So if you have a little look at the calculator that's available after this talk via the Academy's website, you can work out exactly what you need. Whether you go for HEPA, ultraviolet, or electrostatic is a conversation with clinical engineering, a conversation with your facilities management department. By and large, UVC probably is minimum maintenance, so facilities would like it. Finance will probably like HEPA because it's the cheapest of the option.
Amanda, one of the things I forgot to say in my talk is that it was both HEPA and UVC is the ones that we used. I think that does give you a belt and braces approach. They are slightly more expensive, but I think in terms of clearance, they do clear quicker. They're much more effective, and therefore that would be useful to go with. I think, as Tony says, if you work with your estates teams and you know the size of the room, and you know what sort of clearance rates you want. If you use the calculator, it will actually help you take that forward.
So I think just to summarise, it seems to be that we've got a real variation in doing spirometry in general practice or in mobile units. There seems to be a real difference in approaches to it, from just opening a window and having the mask, but it seems to be that you're recommending having the air scrubber, the air filter, as well as the infection control, as well as the mask, and just maintaining that and looking at the air changes per hour, because it seemed to be from some literature that they were sort of reducing precaution and the air changes an hour wasn't as vital. But from listening today, it seems like we need to look at fallow time still, but the approach seems to have been the opposite, where people are saying, you know, we can relax, but it seems to be that we need to stay on top of that.
It's interesting you said that, Amanda. I had a discussion with our senior management team in Cambridge the other day, which was around mixed messages.
Yes.
And mixed messages are coming out at the moment. So
yes,
so we're clearly COVID hasn't gone away.
No.
But yet the messages are, we don't need to use these things. We got rid of them. Now we had to bring them back very quickly if you're going into clinical areas. But yet we don't have a problem. But yet we're not going to be doing routine testing. So there is these mixed messages going on, which isn't that helpful.
Yeah, it's very confusing because there is a wide approach. And it can be simply, some people are just opening a window and that is seen as suffice with a mask, and others are using the filters, fallow time, and then it's deemed as not needed. So it really leaves you confused.
But thank you, Amanda. I'm going to sort of bring in a couple of other questions now that are sort of follow on from this discussion. Brendan, you asked some questions about, well, how much aerosol will actually cause an infection, and then you were both commenting on whether does that mean we need to start changing clothes when we leave the hospital, and I think that would be and Brendan, you also say, and that if therefore stop being so complacent about using air scrubbers in ICU, because it might help reduce the secondary infections. So if we can show this clinical effectiveness, is this an argument towards the the finance people about buying these things? Who would like to take that question?
I don't mind. So taking the second part first, in terms of bioaerosols in general, rather than just SARS-CoV-2, I think we've been able to show that actually we can reduce a lot of the respiratory pathogens that sit in the ICU that actually create issues in terms of lung well, basically it's acquired infection from the ICU, isn't it, effectively? So I think by using air scrubbers, if we can actually reduce that bio burden that's effectively as respiratory aerosols in the ICU, then it's beneficial both to patients as well as staff going forwards.
Just a thought, Brendan, about changing clothes or whatever. Has anybody got any evidence at all that SARS-CoV-2 is transmissible via clothing or even by surfaces?
I think there's evidence in Delta and BKK, which is one of the viruses in Hong Kong and Singapore at the moment, showing that actually it is more surface transmissible than it is aerosol transmissible. But it hasn't. I don't think it's been seen in the UK. So
yeah. I've looked at this in some detail, Paul, and I've not come across that. Just to reiterate that the NHSE is still really focused on the fallow time argument, and so this committee that's just been put together, I mentioned in my penultimate slide, I don't know when we're going to report on that, but that's an entirely focused piece of work on fallow times to mitigate the hazard and risk associated with airborne transmission and fallow time reduction. So that's going to be a formal report. It's going to be a full review, and there's about there must be about 12 people who are quite expert in the field. So hopefully we can sort of resolve some of the equivocality, Paul, and double messaging that you mentioned, multiple messaging.
Brendan.
You're on mute.
It happens to the best of us. Yeah. Thanks for all three of you for fantastic evidence of, detection of aerosols and then eliminating them, and the good hard science that this works, and then also the bioverification side, so important. I think where a lot of people are quite anxious, and I'm seeing this obviously from a respiratory physiology point of view, is this concern of the risk. And when the guidelines were initially drawn up, there was no vaccine. Dexamethasone hadn't been discovered to be quite good. People on conventional therapy were dying on ITU. So it was a very different circumstance. And I think our collective psychology has changed because we're quite almost complacent as a public about COVID. But I think some of the questions are, about all aerosol infection and not just this one little nasty bug, which keeps changing all the time. And so we actually, have we been too complacent historically, certainly within the ITU environment, the respiratory ward, or maybe even the lung function testing facilities in primary and secondary care? It just does beg a question: Are we just changing our psychology, or is there a discovery of a risk which we've always taken for granted?
I think, Brendan, I think that is a very valid point, and one of the reasons why we wanted to look at ICU-induced lung infection, which is one of the other elements of the study that we were doing, not looking at SARS-CoV-2, was trying to actually answer that question. It was an element of seeing patients that had a variety of complications, and it was, well, why is this? And I think the whole thing, the plates that we use in terms of pathogens and the respiratory panel that we use for the PQCR has all of the sort of respiratory pathogens that you could think of on it, in order to try and actually not only detect them, but also whether this technology can actually reduce or remove them.
Okay, yes. Well, Chris, I was just going to come on to you, actually. There's a couple of questions for you. Did you want to add to this point?
Yeah, only that, just to remind people that we are complacent in a way. I am, because we've all had the vaccine now, but filtration and all these other brilliant methods of controlling aerosols, it doesn't really care which virus we're talking about. So if this bird flu kicks off and starts, coming into the human population, and we have a big problem with that, the knowledge and the experience we've got from this is going to be directly transferable to whichever virus comes next. So I think, the investment here is absolutely worthwhile. So that was just a point I wanted to make.
Yeah, a good one, Chris. Thanks. You and Edie, you asked a question, I think, of Chris and the nearness of the extraction unit to the aerosol production. Would you like to ask your question? Is Ewan still on the call?
Sorry, I'm just unmuting at the moment.
Oh, Edie Ewan, I'm sorry, I got your surname and things. I do beg your pardon.
Hi there, thank you very much. Yeah, Chris, it was just to ask if those were lovely images of the contamination on the gamma camera from the Technigas machine. I was just wondering, did you have any sort of follow-up images if you used your filter device along with the Technigas system, and does it make a difference? There's some evidence from the sort of laser safety and laser plume in tissue that the extraction unit has to be very close to the source of the plume or the infectious particles in this.
Yeah.
And does it matter?
Right. So unfortunately, can I just see if I can share a little picture how close I get the thing? Because I tried to show this and it didn't quite work. Can you see that? Oh, hang on a minute. Wow, go away. No, I've lost it. Sorry. No, I don't think you can see that, can you? Sorry. I'll stop sharing. Sorry. I had real problems with this. Is it there now?
No.
Still not. I'm going to give
Afraid
up.
not.
Okay. Well, if you download the whole thing, then hopefully that'll stop working. Okay. So, and you can have a look at that. So basically, the filtration unit just goes to the side of the face. So there is a draft going across the patient, and it's that close. So this is why I like my system so much, because you're capturing it at source as it's exhaled from the patient. On the condensate business, on a cold day, you can see your breath, can't you? You know, in a cold day, because you get condensation of all the water vapors into like a cloud. And one cold day, not only did the ventilation not work in my old hospital, but the heating didn't work either. So it was absolutely freezing. And it was wonderful because I saw this one of my patients, they exhaled this radioactivity, and you could see the steam just taking out, and then it got caught by the cross flow of the ventilation pump, and it just sucked itself into the ventilation pump. It was rather like that scene in Harry Potter where the Dementors just sucked out somebody's soul. It was absolutely wonderful to see. So it does work at very close quarters, and it removes it at very close quarters. Since I've been using that filter, we've never had any problems with contamination of our gamma cameras. Now, I'll need to do some work because we've moved into a new hospital with brand new gamma cameras, and we're going to see if these things pick things up. But the effectiveness has been absolutely astounding, and I really do recommend this technique to those people who can't get the HEPA filtration. It's only, I mean, it's a couple of £1,000 to buy the filtration unit, and that's all it costs, and it will take these things away.
I look forward to seeing your presentation at the British Nuclear Medicine Society, Chris, telling everyone to be doing that. Tony, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just a note, Chris, of course, the dentists have been really on this for a couple of years now, so they've got a lot of kit. They understand this very, very well. But in your lovely new hospital that we know so much about, our new hospital, you're probably getting between 5 and 10 ACH anyway. So I really think your problem might not be a problem anymore there.
Well, I hope it wouldn't stick around for more than an hour. So yeah, I mean that would be phenomenal. That, you know,
yeah,
but to get it taken away in the meantime, because patients do cough on you, and if it can be withdrawn, you know, out of the way, and we'll see how it works in this new hospital. Just for completion, that thing when it's on is 170 meters cubed an hour it takes, which is quite a lot, which is cleansing the thing. So when we did have COVID patients when they weren't even coming for lung scans, I would suggest to my colleagues, with no evidence, but stick this thing on and it will cleanse the air around you, and it didn't do any harm, put it that way.
Yeah,
well, it seems far more sophisticated than the big shower curtain that we used at University College Hospital to surround the patient with. Sorry, Tony, I interrupted you. Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I'll just say that knowing the size of it, you know, your clinical facilities in nuclear medicine, you probably want to, you know, 400-500 cubic meters per hour kind of minimum, really. But it's interesting, isn't it, that you know, one shouldn't be challenged by this. We should be environments where the hospital facilities are what they are. They're regulated, you know, they're in a new hospital, they are law. There would not be an issue. In the States, you'd be given 15 ACH in your environment, you know, it's virtually windy. But the trouble with going to your estates department saying, look, the regulations say I need 5 ACH, I need 10, give it to me, please. They'll say yes, but that's not retrospective. That's only on new hospitals going forward. As clinical scientists, we have responsibility to deliver best practice, so you can try that argument. But in terms of HCM03, it is not retrospective.
There's a couple of other questions, but just to follow up on that, is there a role therefore for the professional societies to start putting some very public statements out there? So for instance, Amanda was referencing the ATRP professional society around spirometry. Is there also a place for IPEM to be sort of stepping forward from the clinical engineering group and saying, you know, these are our recommendations for retrofitting things? Just putting it out there. Vicky Jones has asked the question, are we sure that spirometry is classed as an aerosol generating procedure? And in her hospital, I think infection control teams say this is not classed as such. Vicky, do you want to open your mic and come and discuss that?
Hi. Yeah, we do spirometry and transfer factors in a very small room in our cardiology department. We have been using air filtration. It's 6 air changes a minute, and we've been COVID testing patients prior to coming in. Now, infection control have said that spirometry is no longer classed as an AGP. So they're trying to get rid of COVID testing and room filtration. I'm just wondering what the general advice would be on that.
To me, with COVID, it doesn't matter whether you're got by an AGP or you're got by a cloud of single virons.
Yeah.
I think some of the arguments be completely consumed by AGPs. AGPs only exist on a spectrum of particle sizes anyway, so please be very, very careful. The inertia behind all this, you know, was fallow times in dentistry and endoscopy, and then it's bloomed out into other clinical areas, and it's kind of got momentum. It's gone the wrong area. It's not. We can talk about AGPs. You can think about AGPs, but in a way, they're quite easy particles to deal with because they're heavy and they tend to precipitate anyway. Please do not, if you've got a patient who's breathing, and hopefully they will be expiring singletons and smaller particles than AGPs down at 1 micron. And there's every bit of much of a hazard as an AGP is. So please don't focus too much on AGPs. I would, if your team there are saying we don't have a hazard to worry about because it's no longer AGPs, I think they're missing a trick completely.
Right. That's great, thank you.
So going back to a question that Ewan asked earlier in the messaging was, so if we're all agreed that some sort of air filtering, air scrubbing is needed in clinical spaces, are there any downsides? Why wouldn't we put them in? What are the downsides? There are none. You're going to tell me there are none. Paul, you're on mute.
There are minimal downsides. The portable units, obviously, you know, you have to, they're on the floor. So, you know, there are trip hazards, but if you put them in appropriate places that you minimize and do risk assessments, that you would minimize that. I can't think of any other, if you got ceiling based units, even less so. I can't see that there is any negative element. There's one thing that you've got to bear in mind is that the filters do need changing and the units do need maintenance once in a while, so you can't keep running it forever and then expect it to be the same efficiency that it was when it was brand new. But it is, as long as you follow manufacturers' instructions in terms of changing either lamps in terms of UV or filters, then I can't see that being an issue. Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I think we are becoming aware. I think that the widespread use of these portable units was absolutely great as an acute response to the pandemic. As things mature, we're moving away from that now, and I'm seeing more and more wall-mounted units or not induct, in-ceiling units. And the technology is getting really quite clever now, and the technology is is developing such that you can have overnight installation really rather cheaply. So the arguments against it are really becoming quite small, and the costs are small. They're not great. You know, you see an extra 3 patients because you've got your fallow time sorted, and you've paid for it. You've paid for it. I've seen some reasonably good units at the moment that cost £600 or less and doing 800 cubic meters per hour. So I mean, that's astonishing. That's an order of magnitude better than where we were in end of 2020.
Amanda's brought up another question, but do you know what, Amanda? I think we could end up talking about this all afternoon. I'm gonna sort of bring it back round to, so Ewan's just mentioned that the nuclear medicine, lung, and possibly the spirometry piece is different from, say, ICU, in as much as you got very localized source from the patient coming, but then in ICU you're cleaning rooms as a whole, so you've got sort of different things going on. And then Brendan's talked about he'd be happy to get together in a sort of multi-professional society forum to start putting together some guidance on aerosols, which I think is a great idea. But I have a question as well. Who in the hospitals and the GP surgeries should take ownership over this? Because I think what I'm getting the impression from people like Amanda and Vicky is that they don't feel like they've got a voice against infection control or against their finance people who say, well, this is costing money that, you know, otherwise we wouldn't. So who do you think should take ownership of this in clinical practice?
So this is a slightly grey area. You know, so technically you could argue it's not a medical device. Therefore, you know, where does it sit? Should it sit under estates? We try here at Adamworks, we try to work in collaboration with estates on these, that we're working together. We've purchased quite a lot of them for use around the hospital. They are maintaining them technically because they're not a medical device, but I think it's an interesting question. We didn't have too much of a problem in putting together a business case for the use of them to our finance director, because as Tony says, if you reduce your fallow time sufficiently enough and you can do more throughput, it's about increasing the throughput and therefore increasing the income to the trust. So I don't think finance was too much of a problem.
On the other hand, Paul, if I may interrupt you, you are a professor of clinical engineering, biomedical engineering, I think, and quite, you know, head of department. So are we saying to our respiratory colleagues that go suss out your clinical engineering department and get them on your team?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, okay, there's lots of things coming in now and we've got 3 minutes to go. So Professor O'Connor, would you like to close the meeting?
I would be delighted to close the meeting. It's
Oh
been
dear, that sounds a bit grim.
It's a fascinating couple of hours that we've had here. And I really would like to thank Chris, Tony and Paul for very, very stimulating presentations, which has kept the audience glued to the screens. Not many people have actually departed early. Like to thank Brendan, Kirsty and Carly for putting this together on behalf of the Academy, and thank my splendid co-chair, Dr. Anna Barnes, for sorting out the questions and answers. I think this has been very, very worthwhile, and I do hope, Brendan, that we can put together other stimulating topics which will generate further interest, and it will also promote the Academy, which is something that we all must do. So thank you all very, very much, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.